I knew the project was doomed the moment our newly promoted VP, Ethan Calloway, walked into the conference room holding nothing but a napkin with scribbles on it. On that flimsy piece of diner paper sat his plan to streamline a contract worth $50 million. To anyone else, it probably looked bold, even visionary. To me, it was a death sentence. I'd been running specialized contract projects for over a decade at Stratwell Industries, and this deal was supposed to be the crown jewel, the one that would set the company up for years. My team and I had spent months building trust with the client, line by line, handshake by handshake, clause by clause. I could recite every deliverable in that contract the way a priest recites scripture. We weren't just consultants or project managers. We were the glue holding together the most valuable deal Stratwell had ever secured. That glue was made from early flights across time zones, troubleshooting servers at midnight, answering client calls during Thanksgiving dinners, and fixing problems before the client even realized there was one. And then Ethan walked in, fresh from a boardroom promotion he didn't earn. He strutted like a man who believed leadership was measured in volume, not vision. He was loud, allergic to details, and convinced that looking decisive was more important than being right. Every week he barged into project meetings with another big swing that ignored technical requirements, timelines, or even the laws of physics. We warned him. God, we warned him. But to Ethan, warnings were negativity. In his world, hesitation meant weakness, and caution meant fear. He wanted wins, fast ones, for his next performance review. If that meant bulldozing the very process that created those wins in the first place, so be it. One afternoon, he declared the client didn't need certain deliverables in the original scope. On paper, that sounded small. But in reality, those deliverables were legally binding, the foundation of the deal. Removing them was like trying to sell a house without the concrete slab beneath it. My team explained it, calmly, patiently. Ethan just smiled, that smug smirk people wear when they think you're cute for worrying, and then he pushed ahead anyway. That was the moment I saw the cracks. Not in the project, not yet, but in the trust. And in our business, once trust goes, everything else follows. By then, my days were filled with nothing but damage control. My team, some of the sharpest engineers, analysts, and negotiators I'd ever worked with, were running on caffeine and nerves. Instead of innovating, we were patching Ethan's self-inflicted holes. I'd stay late in the office, staring at the contract binder, and wonder how much longer before the structure gave way. And buried deep in that binder was a clause almost no one remembered, except me. Years ago, during the brutal negotiations, I had fought to insert a safeguard, a performance bond clause, tying the entire $50 million contract to my continued employment at Stratwell. The logic was simple. If I, the architect and point person of the deal, was removed, the bond collapsed and the client could walk away without penalty. At the time, I hadn't trusted corporate leadership to resist scapegoating my team if things went wrong. So I demanded the clause as insurance. The client loved it. They wanted to know the people they trusted wouldn't be shuffled away for some budget cut. Stratwell's execs had grumbled, but signed anyway, too desperate to close the deal. Back then, I thought of it as just another line of fine print, protection I'd hopefully never need. But now, watching Ethan blunder through meetings, I started to feel the weight of that clause like a live grenade in my pocket. He strutted, oblivious, throwing smirks across the table while sawing away at the foundation he was standing on. He had no idea that with one wrong move, one arrogant decision, he wasn't just risking my career. He was gambling the company's future. And the best part? I didn't have to say a single word, because sometimes silence is the sharpest weapon you'll ever carry. It was a Wednesday morning, the kind that already feels heavy before your feet even hit the floor. My inbox looked like a war zone, client emails turning sharper by the hour, my team running on fumes. That's when the invite hit my calendar. Urgent meeting, conference room C. No agenda, just mandatory. That's never good news. When I walked in, my team was already seated, faces pale, coffee cups gripped like life preservers. Ethan stood at the head of the table, leaning forward on his fists like some washed-up football coach about to yell at kids for losing the championship game. And then I saw it. The smirk. The same smug grin he wore whenever he thought he'd finally proven himself the genius savior of Stratwell Industries. Only this time, it was aimed squarely at me. "Let's not waste time," he barked, loud enough for people walking by to hear. "This project is sinking, and it's because of you." He jabbed a finger at my chest like he was swatting away a fly. My team's eyes darted to mine. They were searching for a signal, anything, but I stayed neutral. Years in this business had taught me that the moment you show emotion in a room like this, you've already lost. Ethan launched into his performance. Missed milestones, lack of initiative, failure to adapt. All the corporate buzzwords he'd pulled from some leadership blog. Not one mention of the reckless scope changes he had forced through, or the deadlines he had slashed in half. No, in his story, we were the incompetent ones, and he was the reluctant hero cleaning house. Then he leaned back, crossed his arms, and delivered the line he'd clearly rehearsed in the mirror. "Be grateful we're not suing you." For a moment, I just looked at him. Not because the threat scared me. Lawsuits cost money, and Stratwell was already bleeding, but because in that single instant, everything clicked into place. He thought he was ending my career. What he didn't realize was that he had just pulled the pin on the one clause that could blow the company sky high. The performance bond. That $50 million lifeline was tied directly to my employment. Terminate me, and it wasn't just weakened. It was revoked. No wiggle room, no interpretation. Automatic breach. Inside, I felt the shift like a pressure drop before a storm. On the outside, I simply nodded. Slow, measured, like I was taking his words seriously. But in truth, it was like flipping a switch. I didn't need to argue. I didn't need to fight. The contract was already wired to detonate the second HR logged my termination. He waved us off with a flick of his hand, already moving on in his head to his next urgent meeting. My team sat frozen, staring at the table, whispering in shock. A couple of them were on the verge of tears. Sarah, who had spent more nights in hotel ballrooms than her own bed to keep this project alive, looked down at her hands, knuckles white around a pen. Daniel, my best systems guy, blinked hard, jaw tight. Even Mike, the joker of the group, was silent, lips pressed into a flat line. And me? I sat there perfectly still, not out of shock, not out of fear, but because I knew opening my mouth would ruin everything. Silence. That was my weapon now. Because buried deep in the contract Ethan never bothered to read, my termination meant one thing. The performance bond shall be deemed revoked in full. The detonator was already live. As security escorted us to HR to collect our boxes, I didn't tell my team not to worry. I didn't give them false hope about being rehired. Instead, I told them the only truth that mattered. You did good work here. The best. It wasn't much, but it was something to hold on to as we walked out with cardboard boxes of our careers. Through the glass walls, I caught one last glimpse of Ethan laughing with another exec, probably gloating about cleaning house. If only he knew that in firing me, he hadn't cleaned anything. He'd just ripped out the foundation. And in less than 24 hours, he was going to watch the entire structure collapse on top of him. The hallway felt different when you've just been fired. The fluorescent lights buzzed louder. The carpet seemed rougher under your shoes, and every framed photo on the wall felt like it was staring at you with pity. Security followed a polite but pointed distance behind us. The kind of silent presence that made sure you remembered your badge didn't open doors anymore. My team carried their boxes like evacuees after a storm. Coffee mugs, family photos, a few stress balls, The little artifacts of lives lived in cubicles. It didn't feel like leaving a job. It felt like an evacuation. We didn't speak much. What was there to say? Anger and tears wouldn't change the fact that Ethan had just erased months of work and years of trust with a single arrogant command. As we passed the glass-walled corner office, I slowed just enough to glance inside. Ethan was leaned back in his leather chair, laughing with another executive. I caught just enough of their conversation to hear 2 words: cleaning house. That was the moment, not when he fired me, not when security took my badge, that the quiet satisfaction began humming in my chest. He thought he had won. He thought he had cut out the problem. But what he'd really done was detonate it. I didn't look at him again. I kept walking, my box in hand, my face calm. But inside, I was already counting down. The clause was airtight. The moment HR logged my termination, the bond provider system would trigger automatically. One email, just one, would land in the client's legal counsel's inbox, stamped with a single word: revoked. And that was all it would take. Revocation wasn't a technicality. It was a guillotine blade. The client's trust rating on the project would drop to 0 in an instant. The contract would collapse with no appeals, no delays, no negotiations. I had designed it that way years ago. Not out of malice, but as protection. If the company ever tried to shuffle me out mid-project, the client deserved to know the keystone had been ripped away. At the time, I never imagined it would come back like this. By the time we reached the lobby, the receptionist gave us a sympathetic smile, the kind you reserve for funerals. We signed the last bit of paperwork, handed over our badges, and stepped out into the cold. The air felt sharper, cleaner somehow. Not because I was free, but because I was holding a secret so sharp it could cut a corporation in half. On the train ride home, I watched the city blur past. Office towers, cranes, billboards, all of them reminded me how many times I had defended Stratwell, fought for its deals, pulled miracles out of nothing to save its reputation. And now? My silence would be the undoing of the very people who thought I was disposable. I didn't need to sue. I didn't need to send angry emails. The mechanism was already in motion, humming along with merciless precision. When I reached my apartment, I set the box from my desk on the kitchen table and left it untouched. My place was quiet, unnaturally so. The kind of quiet that follows a storm but still holds electricity in the air. I poured a glass of water, sat at the table, and pulled out my phone. One thing had to be certain: verification. I knew the clause inside out. I had written it, fought for it, defended it against 2 rounds of red lines. But I also knew corporate lawyers, and desperation makes people try to twist iron into rubber. So I called David Klein, an old friend and veteran contracts attorney. Performance bond, tied to my employment, $50 million contract, I told him. I was terminated today. Am I right in thinking that bond is gone? He didn't even pause. Gone. The second HR files it, and if the bond's gone, the contract's dead. No patch without you. Next, I called Melissa Tran, who once worked inside the bond provider's system. Her laugh was low, almost wicked. Oh, they'll send the revocation notice before you've even finished dinner. It's automated. The client will see it tonight. 2 more calls, 2 more confirmations. By the time I hung up, it was unanimous. The clause wasn't just enforceable. It was a sledgehammer already mid-swing. All I had to do now was wait. Because in less than 24 hours, Ethan was going to find out what revoked really meant. The next morning started like any other, at least for me. I wasn't rushing out the door, wasn't glued to my inbox. The sun slid through the blinds, coffee filled the kitchen with its steady comfort, and for the first time in months, I felt unhurried. But for Stratwell Industries, that morning was the beginning of their collapse. Halfway through my first cup, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Sarah. One of the few teammates Ethan hadn't cut yet. Just 4 words, no punctuation. Something's going down. I took a slow sip before replying. Find something. 3 dots appeared, disappeared, then reappeared. Finally, client got a call from the bond provider this morning. Revoked is the word flying around. People are freaking out. I smiled into my mug. Right on schedule. The thing about a performance bond revocation is that it isn't just paperwork. It's a siren. To the client, it screams no confidence. To Stratwell, it means deadlines, payments, and credibility are suddenly quicksand. To the bond provider, it means they've washed their hands clean. I could already picture it. Executives huddled in corners, managers whispering in hallways, emails firing off with that jittery rhythm of panic. Somewhere in that chaos, Ethan was probably still calm, maybe even dismissive. He'd be telling himself, "It's just a formality, we'll sort it out." But the truth would land soon. The revocation notice didn't stop at project managers. It went straight to the client's senior legal counsel, the same sharp-eyed lawyer who had insisted on that clause in the first place. That's where the real panic would begin. My phone buzzed again, this time from a friend in finance. They're pulling everyone into a call at 11. Looks bad. 2 minutes later, another message. Your boy looks like he hasn't slept. Not sure he knows why yet. That was the delicious part. The storm had already broken, but Ethan was still standing in the rain without an umbrella, too busy congratulating himself to notice the water rising. I topped off my coffee and leaned back in my chair. I didn't need to be in the office to feel the tension tightening its grip floor by floor. The mechanism was already in motion, and the beauty of a mechanism like this was simple. Once triggered, it didn't stop until it was finished. By noon, the texts were coming so fast, I had to silence my phone. First, an old colleague in IT, all hands in the exec wing, CEO's here, legal's here. Ethan looks like he's aged 10 years overnight. Then someone in procurement, client's legal team is on a call with the CEO. And Ethan. You're going to love this. I already knew how that conversation would start. I knew those lawyers, their style. Direct, cold, surgical. Sure enough, 5 minutes later, a new message buzzed through. Their opening line had been, "Can you explain the meaning of the word revoked?" I laughed out loud, nearly spilling my coffee. Oh, I could explain it. I could recite the clause word for word. Upon cessation of the named party's employment, performance bond shall be deemed revoked in full, with no reinstatement possible without the client's written consent. Legal poetry. Brutal. Final. And now it was being read back to Ethan, the very man who had unknowingly pulled the trigger. I imagined the blood draining from his face. That split second when arrogance cracks into confusion and confusion hardens into panic. Because without the bond, the contract wasn't weakened. It was dead. And with the contract dead, the client had every right to walk away today. Money in hand, damages claim ready. From what I later heard, the silence on that call was suffocating. Ethan tried to spin it, muttering about transitional challenges and operational restructuring. The client's lawyer didn't even acknowledge him, just repeated the question. Can you explain what revoked means in this context? And that's the thing about legal language. It isn't flexible when both parties signed off. It means what it says. By the time the call ended, the damage was irreversible. The client had their exit. The bond was void. Stratwell's flagship project was sinking in real time. And the best part? I wasn't in the building. I wasn't on the call. I wasn't even logged into their system anymore. This wasn't sabotage. It was simply arrogance meeting reality. By the time the sun started dipping behind the skyline, Stratwell's so-called hiccup had transformed into a 5-alarm disaster. At 5:07 p.m., the internal memo dropped. The client had formally withdrawn from the project, not renegotiated, not paused, not requested adjustments, withdrawn completely. The $50 million crown jewel Stratwell had paraded in press releases and board presentations was now a smoking crater in the books. No payout, no goodwill, no saving face. And that was only the first blow. Within the hour, the bond provider sent their own notice, an official statement to their network, effectively blacklisting Stratwell from any future large-scale performance guarantees. That was the corporate equivalent of a bank putting you on a do-not-lend list. For a company built on billion-dollar contracts and investor confidence, it wasn't just a red flag. It was a death sentence written on letterhead. The ripple effect was immediate. Investors caught wind of the breach, the blacklist, and the withdrawal all at once. Stock alerts buzzed across trading floors. By closing bell, Stratwell's share price had taken a nosedive so steep it was trending on finance news tickers. Calls were flying. Emergency meetings stacked back to back. Directors pacing like caged animals in hallways they once strolled like kings. And in the center of it all, Ethan Callaway. The golden boy turned scapegoat. By nightfall, I was getting messages from people I hadn't heard from in years. Former colleagues, vendors, even a recruiter I'd brushed off last year. All of them with some version of, "Holy hell, have you seen this?" I didn't reply. I didn't forward the memo. I didn't even click like on the trending LinkedIn posts already whispering about Stratwell's collapse. Because sometimes the loudest voice is silence. Inside Stratwell, Ethan couldn't walk 10 feet without someone stopping mid-conversation, eyes narrowing. His name wasn't being whispered with criticism anymore. It was being spoken with venom. The kind of tone that signals not just failure, but betrayal. Meanwhile, I sat at my kitchen table, glass in hand, watching the evening city lights flicker on. I didn't feel the need to gloat. This wasn't chaos I'd engineered. It was the inevitable result of arrogance colliding with reality. The truth was, Ethan hadn't just fired me. He had pulled the keystone out of the very arch that held his empire up. By the end of day one, Stratwell wasn't fighting to save a project. They were fighting to survive the reputational crater it had left behind. And then came day two. The dust didn't settle. It thickened. Emails from insiders kept flooding in. Some were furious, blaming Ethan for everything. Others were scared, watching the walls close in. A few were quietly amused, though none dared admit it out loud. That morning, while flipping pancakes in my kitchen, my phone lit up with an unfamiliar number. I didn't need caller ID to guess who it was. The CEO's office. I let it ring twice before silencing it. A minute later, voicemail. Curiosity got the better of me. I played it on speaker, leaning against the counter. The assistant's voice was polished but frayed at the edges. "Hi. We'd like to discuss bringing you back in to lead the project, with your team reinstated, of course. We believe there's a path forward to repair the relationship with the client. The CEO would like to make a formal offer." I almost laughed. Repair the relationship? That ship hadn't just sailed. It was already at the bottom of the ocean, claimed by the fish. The client was gone. The bond was dead. The blacklist had slammed the door on any future deal of that scale. They weren't asking me to lead a project. They were asking me to resurrect a corpse. I didn't call back. What would I say? "Sure, I'll rebuild the thing you gleefully burned down, just for old time's sake?" No. The truth was, Stratwell hadn't just lost a client. They'd lost the only thing you can't buy back in this business, trust. And they lost it in the most public, preventable way possible. The voicemail sat on my phone like an unanswered prayer. I deleted it without replying. There was nothing to discuss, nothing to salvage. Stratwell wasn't just bleeding. It was gutted. The client had withdrawn. The bond was void. The blacklist had slammed the door on future deals, and the investors were circling like sharks in bloody water. By midweek, I was getting play-by-play updates from former colleagues who still had one foot inside the building. The CEO had spent the last 48 hours locked in back-to-back conference calls, trying to spin the collapse as a temporary setback. But every attempt ran headfirst into the same brick wall. The contract breach was clean, the damages justified, and the blacklist irreversible. There's no way to bluff your way out of that. And Ethan Callaway? He had gone from corporate golden boy to walking disaster overnight. Executives who once clapped him on the back in boardrooms now avoided eye contact. His name was muttered in hallways with disgust, the way you'd mention a virus. When he tried to hold meetings, people showed up late or not at all. Even his assistant, I heard, had started calling in sick. The industry grapevine lit up like wildfire. Procurement managers at other firms whispered about Stratwell's collapse over drinks. Competitors smirked. Even recruiters started framing the story as a cautionary tale. Don't be an Ethan. Don't ignore your contract lawyers. Don't silence the people who actually know what they're doing. For me, it was surreal watching it all unfold from my quiet apartment. I didn't make speeches, didn't gloat online, didn't forward the news to anyone. I simply let silence do its work. Because silence is heavier than noise when everyone else is scrambling. Every headline, every rumor, every whispered conference call carried the same truth. Stratwell had destroyed itself, and the detonator was Ethan's arrogance. What made it poetic was that none of it had been hidden. The clause that sank them had been sitting in plain sight for years, signed by their own executives, explained by me in negotiations. They hadn't just ignored the warning, they'd fired the warning. I poured another cup of coffee and leaned back in my chair, scrolling through the day's updates. One former colleague texted, "He looks like he hasn't slept in days. Keeps saying it's unexpected complications." Another wrote, "He finally realized what triggered the bond collapse. You should have seen his face when legal spelled it out." I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. But then I remembered that smirk, that jab of his finger when he fired me in front of my team. The way Sarah's knuckles turned white around her pen, the quiet tears sliding down Daniel's face. The humiliation, the arrogance, the utter disregard for the people who'd kept the project alive. No, I didn't feel sorry for him. If anything, I felt a grim satisfaction. Not because Ethan was suffering, but because the universe had finally corrected itself. This wasn't my revenge. This was justice, the natural consequence of hubris. By Friday, the stock price had cratered so badly that news outlets were calling it a confidence collapse. Investors demanded an emergency board meeting, and according to one insider's text, the question was no longer if Ethan would survive, but how quickly he could be removed without further embarrassment. The irony? The very clause that ended him had once been dismissed as paranoia. Back when I pushed for it, Stratwell's leadership had rolled their eyes. Too cautious, too demanding. But that clause had saved my team from being scapegoated and burned the company instead. I didn't need to brag. The lesson was already etched into the industry like a scar. Years from now, people would still be whispering about it. The $50 million contract killed by one arrogant VP. And they would remember Ethan Callaway's name. Not as a leader, not as a visionary, but as the man who fired the keystone and brought the whole house down. 2 days later, the dust hadn't settled. It had thickened into a choking haze. My phone was still buzzing with updates from people on the inside, but by then the story had spread well beyond Stratwell. Trade publications were dissecting the collapse. LinkedIn was filled with vague leadership lessons posts, and competitors were already pitching the client, eager to scoop up the scraps. That morning, As I was making breakfast, my phone rang again. Another unfamiliar number, but the area code gave it away. Stratwell headquarters. I let it ring. Then came the voicemail. The voice was professional, but brittle around the edges. The CEO himself this time. "We'd like to formally invite you to return. We'll reinstate your team, and we're prepared to make concessions. We believe there's still an opportunity to restore confidence with the client if you lead the effort." I let the message finish, then deleted it without a second thought. There was nothing left to restore. The client was gone. The bond was dead. The blacklist had slammed shut. No amount of reinstating me or anyone else could resurrect a corpse. Stratwell hadn't just lost a project. They'd lost credibility. And in this industry, credibility isn't something you buy back. It's something you bleed for years to rebuild, if you ever can. The irony was almost too perfect. The very clause that had gutted them, the one tied to my employment, had been explained to them in plain English years ago. I'd stood in front of their legal team and spelled it out. But arrogance has a way of making people deaf. They thought firing me was a clean break, that the machine would keep humming without me, that the client would smile and nod, none the wiser. Instead, they got a $50 million crater, a client who would never return their calls, and a reputation shredded across every corner of the industry. As for Ethan Callaway, his fall was complete. By Monday morning, the board had stripped him of authority. Officially, he was still on leave, but everyone knew what that meant. His name was already poison. Recruiters weren't calling. Colleagues weren't answering his emails, and from what I heard, he couldn't even walk into a networking event without people turning away. His legacy was sealed, not as a rising star, not as a bold leader, but as the arrogant fool who fired the keystone of a $50 million contract and brought his company down with it. For me, there was no victory lap, no press statement, no whispered, "I told you so." I didn't need one, because my revenge had never required action. The trap had been set years ago, written into a contract clause no one respected until it was too late. All I had to do was sit in my apartment, sip my coffee, and let silence do its work. That's the thing about arrogance. It blinds people to the simplest truths, and the simplest truth of all was this. They had fired the one person the project couldn't function without. They had pulled the pin themselves, and they were the ones who stood in the blast. As the city lights flickered against my window that night, I let myself smile. Not out of spite, not out of bitterness, but out of recognition. Sometimes justice doesn't roar. Sometimes it doesn't even whisper. Sometimes it just sits in silence, inevitable, unmovable, undeniable, until the people who thought they were untouchable finally learn the cost of ignoring it. And Ethan Callaway? He learned it the hard way. The word that ended him wasn't fired, it was revoked.